very honored to have on the show now on Radio War Nerd. So one of my heroes and one of really the great legends for investigative journalism, Robert Parry. He's the author of several books, including America's Stolen Narrative, Lost History, Contra-Cocaine, The Press, and Project Truth. Actually, I was just writing about Project Truth. I'll talk with him about that. Robert Parry, when he worked for AP, the Associated Press, in the early mid-'80s, broke a lot of the big stories around Iran-Contra, including Oliver North illegally running weapons to the Contras when they were supposed to be barred from that. Some of the maybe first stories about the Contras selling cocaine in the United States. And that led also to, I know, a close relationship with Gary Webb when he broke some of these stories about 10 years after I think Parry first did. And you've written a lot about Gary Webb too, and we'll talk about that. Bob Parry also worked for Newsweek and worked with Frontline. And in fact, I even found finally on YouTube, I don't know how long it'll be up there, the episode you guys did on the October surprise, which was, of course, about how the Reagan campaign team secretly connived with Ayatollah Khomeini's people to make sure that the American hostages in Iran were not released until after the election, until after Carter lost and Reagan assumed power. One of the great scandals that has been swept under the rug. And really, Robert is one of the great curators of lost history of the last 50 years, and you can read all of his stuff on his website, Consortium News. I've written for Consortium. I think the first time I wrote for Robert was when I was still in Russia, maybe back in, I want to say maybe 1999. I did something on the oligarchs for you. So anyway, welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, one of the things we've talked about in our episodes now, this is episode 76, is, I mean, a lot of your work kind of dovetails with some of our themes, and one of them is sort of how things changed a lot around the world and in America and in specific areas like the press and sort of the American empire in sort of 1979 through 1983. And so, and then there was kind of cultural change within the Washington media around this time as well. I think first, maybe you could sort of tell us when you first got into journalism, where you started, and then and kind of bring it up to sort of the mid-Reagan years or something.
Well, sure. I'm basically, my dad was involved in newspapers, so it became sort of an easy transition. I worked first after college at a daily paper in Framingham, Massachusetts. Kept changing its name. I think it was then called the South Middlesex News. It was owned by a chain. My dad worked there. He basically kind of ran the place.
Mm-hmm. What sort of stories did you do for them?
So basically, I covered some small towns, Ashland, Hopkinton, Holliston, and then from there, I was hired by the Associated Press, first in Baltimore, which is sort of a kind of what they call a line bureau.
What's that mean?
Well, it means like you're not like, it's not very central. It's not very central. But then there was a recession going on it was now 1974, 75. There was a recession going on, and they cut my job out. I had the least seniority, so they moved me to Providence, Rhode Island, where I worked in a correspondency there. It's two-person correspondency. And that's where I started doing some investigative work. I dealt with there was a lot of corruption, especially in the Democratic Party at the time in Rhode Island, and I was dealing some with the organized crime people. Ray Patriarca was running the organized crime for Southern New England at the time, and I got to know him a bit. And I also did some investigative work on that became somewhat noted regarding the governor and some senior people in the state legislature. So AP then moved me in 1977 to Washington to join the national staff there. And you work on the desk for, late night desk, usually for a year or so. And then Then I was put on Capitol Hill, where I covered budgetary, economic kind of issues, but still did some investigative work on the side. And when, after the election in 1980, I was moved to what they called their special assignment team, which had a rather glorious history in certain ways. Sly Hirsch used to be on it and others, but it had been allowed to sort of shrink to, at that point, only a few people, and I was really the only one doing investigative work. So I began investigating aspects of the Reagan presidency, and that led me to covering material in Central America, which was a hot point for them. And I got to know Oliver North and did the first stories about him. And now we're sort of into the 84-85 period. I did stories about some of the abuses going on in terms of that policy, the CIA's operations in Central America, including their involvement in propaganda and assassinations and so forth. And then so I received some attention there and won a few awards in different ways, but we were always under fire at that point. The Reagan people were very aggressive and effective in trying to keep everybody's heads down. The Associated Press being a cooperative, that meant that the various newspaper publishers around the country had a great deal of say, and they tended to like Reagan, and they didn't really want him to be undercut. And frankly, the senior executives at the Associated Press were very pro-Reagan. Keith Fuller, who was the general manager, even gave a public speech about how Reagan's presidency was a turning point for American history and how we were getting away from those horrible days of hippies and people demonstrating against the Vietnam War and moving into something much better. So it was always sort of going, not just facing the Reagan people and getting the stories, which were hard enough, but also having to deal with a lot of hostility from the senior executives at the Associated Press. Anyway, so that the stories about North, I just kept doing. I was also working for part of this time with Brian Barger, who came in briefly to work at the AP. We together broke the story about the Contra drug trafficking. That was a real dirty secret of this movement. It was a tremendous effort to suppress that information.
Okay, so we decided to switch from the phone interview with Robert Parry. So you might hear a little bit of a sound difference here, but let's continue with the interview now. And then you moved to Newsweek. What year was that you moved to Newsweek?
Well, yeah. So back at AP, what happened was that even though there was a great deal of skepticism, or at least, or even anger about the stories we were doing about Oliver North and the Contras and the Reagan administration's involvement there, it was considered maybe not true. There was a feeling that maybe we'd taken them off on a limb and that it was going to get cut off behind us. But then in October of 1986, one of North's planes was shot down inside Nicaragua, and then things began to unravel. And that's Barger and I went down and actually got hold of a number of the documents that had been carried by the pilot who died in the crash, but his material became available to us. And there was one person on board, Eugene Hassenfuss, who survived, and he began talking about this secretive network that involved the CIA and the White House. So the stories that we had been working on that were being denied and being considered even by the other journalists to be fairly flaky were largely confirmed. And then, of course, subsequent to that, the other shoe fell, which was that there was this involvement between the Reagan White House and the Iranians regarding hostage negotiations. Those hostage negotiations pertained more to Americans who were being held in Lebanon at the time. So you had, and it became clear after a while that there was a link between the two, that Oliver North had been sort of the person who was handling the Contra account, but also handling the Iran account, or the counterterrorism account. And he mixed the programs up by taking some money from the Iran program and shifting it over to the Contras through money laundering operations and so forth. So,
and by overcharging the Iranians,
right?
Right?
The Iranians were overcharged for the American weapons, which they needed because they were in a war with Iraq at the time. And some of the profits sort of ended up in people's pockets, but also wound back to the Contra operations. And that's what gave rise to the Iran-Contra scandal, why they were linked together as the name of the scandal. So at this point, Congress had gotten involved belatedly. And so at that point, my relations with AP, even though they had been sort of mended by the fact that the story turned out to be true, Barger had been sort of pushed out by this point by AP. And I was offered a job at Newsweek, which I perhaps maybe shouldn't have taken, but I did. I kind of thought it was time to get out of the Associated Press. So I went to Newsweek beginning in early 1987.
So I'm sorry to cut you off real quickly here, but
Sure.
So when your story was validated, I mean, I know this as a journalist through the years, having worked on stories where you go against the grain, and there's a lot of eye-rolling, snarky, establishment attitude towards your story. They don't like it when you get ahead of them. And then you're validated, and, then there's sort of two responses to that I've noticed. One is, oh, I always knew you were great. And the other one is basically trying to ignore it and not acknowledge. I don't know. So it sounds to me, though, like at AP, after they, half stuck their neck out to back you up and half didn't, then here it's validated, and it doesn't sound like they rewarded you as much as you should have been. Did they acknowledge it much? Or how did they respond when it was all validated like that?
Well, they still were not very happy, even though it turned out that we were correct. We ended up, as I say, Barger had been pushed out by then. They were not willing to rehire him. And when I left for Newsweek, before I left, I had prepared the Pulitzer Prize entry for this work we had done, which really covered a couple of years. And I thought when I had left that they were submitting it. It turned out that they refused to submit our entry to the Pulitzer Board.
Wow.
And I'm told the Pulitzer Board was waiting for it.
Wow.
But they gave the award to the Miami Herald, which had been sort of following along after us.
I see.
But the AP was didn't want. I guess they felt it was embarrassing that the two people who were involved in the story had no longer at AP.
Right.
So they just didn't want to undergo that criticism. And they were mad because there were stories that were done about how the AP had flinched in connection with the story at high levels. Mm-hmm. And so there was resentment over that, too. They blamed me for some of these stories that did come out at the time, which suggested, actually correctly, that the AP was not particularly enthusiastic about getting us to do these stories. And in fact, they'd stopped us at certain points. They blocked certain stories or delayed them as we were trying to push it forward through 1986. Mm-hmm. So there was still bad blood there in some ways, although I have to say that our stories did get out. Sometimes they were watered down a bit, and I wasn't always happy with the results. But to their credit, I mean, they did let the stories move. Sometimes we had to get them out sort of in odd ways that weren't really expected.
Yeah, can you tell the story about, I forget which one of your Central America stories this was, but one of them where they were holding up, they were nervous, and you put it through, I think you were still in Central America maybe, and you put it through sort of the AP wire for editing.
No, what happened? Okay. What happened with that was the Contra drug story.
The Contra drug story.
And
okay,
we had Barger and I had been in Central America, in Miami. Most of our sources were really Contras, as well as some people in the Reagan administration, including inside the White House. This was known inside the Reagan people, their groups, that the Contras were dabbling in drug trafficking to raise money. So we had all this, although, obviously most of the sourcing was largely unnamed because people felt they would be fired or have retributions if they were attached to it. But the AP knew how much we had, and it was prepared to be published. I sent it. I was in D.C. at the time, but I sent the story in with a note to send it to the bureau chief, who was supposed to give it final approval. But we thought it was going to be clear. We thought all the problems had been resolved, and so it goes to him. And then at the last minute, the New York senior executive editors intervened to stop it, and they basically didn't want it to run at all. But in sending it to him, a copy had automatically gone to the Spanish language side of the Associated Press, and it was just translated and then distributed throughout Latin America. So we began hearing a day or two later. We started getting calls from people in South America saying, "Oh, we liked your story. That was really important," and we didn't know what they were talking about. So this was not intentional. I mean, I think some at AP thought it was, but it wasn't. So I went in and explained this to the bureau chief, who wasn't very happy. But at that point, they felt they had no choice but to then publish it in English as well. So that's how that story.
And I think, it was such a mind-blowing, mind-bending story too, because it's hard to convey the hysteria pushed by the Reagan administration, Nancy and Ronnie, about drugs and cocaine and the evils of drugs, and drugs really had to have been some kind of communist plot, in combination with Satan, and the idea that their freedom fighters, their heroic freedom fighters, were shipping drugs into America to pay for their war. It was like out of the darkest conspiracy you could possibly have imagined. It hurt that brain, right? I mean, it was very very dangerous. It was about as dangerous a story that could possibly have come out.
Well, it was also an attack. The New York Times basically led the way in attacking the story. They were given briefings at the Justice Department saying that none of this was true when it was all true, and so the New York Times and the Washington Post and others chose to essentially take the side of the Reagan administration in denying these stories that the Reagan administration itself knew to be true. Wow. But that was how it went, and that was the problem we had throughout this period, that the major news organizations had stopped doing their jobs. Mm-hmm. They had you might say that in the 1970s with Watergate and Pentagon Papers, et cetera, that you were getting some serious journalism from those big organizations. But by the 1980s, certainly by the mid 1980s, that had stopped. Mm-hmm. They were part of the effort to essentially make the U.S. government look good, and anything that made the U.S. government look bad, they were not very eager to publish. Mm-hmm. So we had this. And AP felt the same way, I should say. But we were able to push through a number of the stories, nevertheless, because they were good stories, and we had them really well nailed down. Mm-hmm. In these cases, people sometimes forget how this felt. We in some of these cases had like a couple of dozen sources. This wasn't a case of having one or two people.
Right.
We had people and they were describing from inside these operations how they were being done. So the information.
Why do you think they were willing to talk to you? Especially, I mean, I noticed top Contra people were talking to you. Is that because there were some Contra people who came from kind of well-to-do, upper middle class families from Nicaragua, right? And it seems like maybe some of them even had a conscience. I mean, why do you think they talked to you about this?
Well, you had factions within the Contras, so it was somewhat one faction talking about another, and then the other faction would talk about the other side. So it was sort of classic. What you do in journalism is you try to get people disputing each other, and in that way you get people to provide you information.
Right.
But it is also true there were Contras who've been part of the more elite elements of Nicaragua. They were smart people, well educated, and they were not into this kind of criminality. Mm-hmm. So they also were helpful. So there were people who were doing it for good reasons, not just to rat out their competition. Although there was some of that too. So And then we also, we had people from the DEA who were not happy with the way they were being handled. Mm-hmm. They saw their job as to stop this sort of thing, and here they were under pressure in many cases to let these drugs go through, or at least not bust the people who were carrying out the drug trafficking. So, and you had people in the White House and the CIA. I mean, there were people who were upset about this, or at least they were willing to, in certain limited ways, to be upset about this. For instance, we had a White House source who was trying to, at that point, discredit one of the Contra factions, which had been sort of outside their control very much, the Pastora faction in operating in Costa Rica. So they were willing to talk about their involvement with drug trafficking, but they were trying to protect some of the others who also were involved in drug trafficking. Right. So that's how journalism often works. But we had a lot of material. This was not like just hearing it from one person, or maybe there were some meetings you're not sure what happened, but you kind of think sounds suspicious. It wasn't like that. This was solid stuff. And ultimately, as you know, it took quite a while. It took Gary Webb and his work in the mid-1990s, and then the CIA itself, with an Inspector General's report in 1998, confirmed everything we had said, and they obviously knew a lot more than we did. So they came out with a very honest report in 1998, confessing as an institution that they knew about the Contra drug problem. It had been consistent throughout the entire 10 years or so of the Contra war. And they had either protected the Contras or they put the information in places that couldn't be found. They denied information to Congress, which should have been provided. So the CIA basically confessed to knowing about this and letting it happen. Obviously, they kept insisting they were not ordering it or running it, but they did acknowledge what we had reported, that the Contras were deeply involved in drug trafficking.
Into America, running drugs into America.
Yes, that's where that was the target.
Right.
One thing that Gary Webb did in his 1996 story, which we did not have really, was he had more of the consequences. Right. We were writing about more that it was happening, that there were these drugs coming in through the Contra operations in El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, and that they were being brought into the United States. What Webb contributed to this whole story a decade later was how it played out after that, how the cocaine was then processed, where it went, how it fed into the problem with crack cocaine, and the devastation it had on many inner city communities.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, his career was destroyed again by Washington Post and New York Times.
Yes, the major newspapers, still not wanting to admit that they'd gotten it wrong in the 80s, tore into him and destroyed his career. Ultimately drove him to suicide because he couldn't find work, and he couldn't support his family, and his marriage broke up. All the horrible things happened to Gary Webb that you could trace back to the refusal of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times to do their jobs.
I thought it was
interested in protecting themselves.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that when the Gary Webb movie came out. So, I mean, as you write about, the CIA then issued its own sort of Inspector General report at the end of the 90s after Gary Webb was destroyed, and the popular culture's idea was, I just remember, Gary Webb was almost a synonym in popular culture, thanks to the Washington Post and the New York Times, a synonym with Alex Jones, and it was thanks to these people smearing him. But then this report came out, and of course it was covered up and not reported on again by the New York Times and Washington Post, in which the CIA admitted all of this and even gave new information. But this was sort of buried by the major media because it was embarrassing to them. And it really wasn't until the movie came out. It says something about our culture. It's not really till a Hollywood movie came out about Gary Webb that they felt compelled finally to, at least some of them, to admit that they were wrong. Certainly the LA Times reporter who was involved in smearing and destroying his career publicly apologized and said he was completely wrong to do that, and Gary Webb was right. I think the Washington Post still sticks to its guns on that.
The Washington Post has continued to trash Gary Webb. Even after the movie came out, I actually communicated with Len Downey, who was the he was the managing editor at the time a lot of this happened, and I actually sort of knew him. He at one point he contacted me about my North stories because they were thinking about doing something and wanted to know there was some issue about whether North's name should be used. The New York Times, when they followed up our AP stories, they left North's name out of it for some reason. Because I guess they were asked to,
right?
Even though he wasn't a covert operative, he was a named person on the National Security Council staff. But so Downey called up at that point and said, "Well, you guys used his name," and I said, "Yeah, we had no reason not to." So I kind of knew Downey a bit, but he went on to be executive editor, and now he's a professor in Arizona, and he wrote there was a very nasty piece done by. I think it was Jeff Lean, who was their investigative editor at the Post.
I read that. It basically said, I don't care what anybody thinks. Gary Webb was a kook. We were right. Why don't you all shut up?
And Len Downey passed that around on his sort of an email chain and said basically that this was all a lie about the Contra drugs and so forth. So some of them are still in denial about this truth, about this reality. Mm-hmm. And to the New York Times, after the CIA report was prepared, they did a story. It was on the front page, but it was sort of half saying, well, there was more here than we may have thought of, but Gary Webb is still wrong. And they did a strange piece that was as far as they would go at that time. That was in 1998. But so you had this pattern of the major news organizations, first of all, being very protective of the U.S. government and its image, and even willing to attack fellow journalists who were telling the truth, doing their jobs right. So it was a very disturbing period, it hasn't ended. It's not like we're out of that period.
Yeah,
it's still going on today.
One thing that struck me about your book, America's Stolen History, is that you trace this back to 1968, and that was the part I had the most trouble understanding because I'm 61. I'm old enough to remember this era, but. It feels completely alien to me. Basically, what you describe is that Nixon's team on the eve of the 1968 presidential election was in communication with both North and South Vietnam, telling them, don't sign anything, obstruct the peace talks until after the election and you'll get a better deal. And the president, Lyndon Johnson, finds out about this through eavesdropping. And what happens then makes no sense to me at all. He seems to have this idea that it's all a gentleman's agreement. And the reason that makes no sense to me is that, as Rick Perlstein and others have pointed out, Nixon's whole career was based on not being a gentleman. Both his friends and his enemies knew that very well. But there seems to be this sense that we must pretend that Nixon and his people are gentlemen, because otherwise the world would collapse. Therefore, we can't reveal this information that would blow him out of the water before the election.
Right. Well, I mean, I think what happened on that regard is that this was fairly several years back. Obviously, because of the Iran-Contra scandal, I should probably take it back a little bit because a lot of this happens in reverse, and that's sort of the narrative goes. While the time goes forward, my investigation goes backwards. But so the Iran-Contra scandal was something that I became deeply involved in investigating when I was at Newsweek and then even later, and that was and the big question I kept coming to, and the same question that Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor, came to, was how did this start?
Right.
And because whenever we'd go, the official line was, it began in 1985. And there was some weapons sent to Iran. It continues in 86, becomes more formalized, et cetera. That's the story. However, it didn't really work. We kept finding that the arms shipments that the Reagan people had approved did not start in 85. It started in 81. And so the question begins, well, how did that occur? and we developed more and more sourcing. Again, in this case, a couple dozen sources as well, including very senior people. The Assistant Secretary for Near East, Nick Veliotis, the former president, the president at that time of 1980 of Iran, Bonnie Sadr, the Defense Minister, Madani. We had a lot of material ultimately about how this really went back to the period in the campaign of 1980 when the Reagan people were making contacts with Iranians behind President Carter's back, while Carter was trying to negotiate a release of 52 Americans who were being held hostage in Iran at the time. So it did appear that, based on all this evidence, and much it's not now as well documentary evidence as well, that the Reagan people, or at least some of them, went behind Carter's back to make sure that he was not able to do what they call the October surprise, which would have been to get these hostages out right before the election, and therefore have him win instead of Ronald Reagan. At the time, the race was very close. It only opened up for Reagan in the last week or so, in part because coincidentally the election was the first anniversary of the hostages being taken. They'd been captured on November 4th of 79, and the election was a year later. So there were a lot of anniversary pieces about this, which led the American people to decide that Jimmy Carter wasn't up to the job. And so they broke heavily for Reagan. Now, but so as part of doing that, people said that's impossible. No way could someone, a campaign, go behind a president's back and undercut him on something as sensitive as 52 Americans, their lives in the balance in Tehran, and doing this for some political advantage.
Keep them hostage. Keep Americans
keep them hostage
held hostage. For a
period of time. Ultimately they were released.
Yeah.
As soon as Reagan was sworn in on January 20th, 1981. Literally, they were held until he'd been sworn in as president, and then they were freed. So but we had this evidence that it wasn't just a coincidence, that it actually was part of a plan and part of something that had been orchestrated by William Casey, who had been Reagan's campaign chairman, later became his CIA director, involving then the vice presidential candidate George H.W. Bush, who had been CIA director, and involving the Israelis, some European intelligence services, and obviously working with the Iranians. But so there was a lot of people didn't want to believe that either, and there's been tremendous resistance to accepting those sets of facts as we develop them. But if you go back to 1968, there's been a story that has percolated for quite a while. Actually, we can actually see some elements being reported in real time in 1968 and 69 about how Richard Nixon went behind President Johnson's back as Johnson was on the verge of negotiating the end of the Vietnam War and trying to bring it to a conclusion with his Paris peace talks, that Nixon had used his intermediaries to go to the South Vietnamese in particular, although he may also have talked to the North Vietnamese, but the South Vietnamese in particular, and said, kill the peace talks, don't show up, we'll get you a better deal. This was to President Tu, who was then the leader of South Vietnam. At that point, there were 500,000 American soldiers in the war zone. 30-some thousand had already died. So in many ways, it was far more outrageous than putting 52 American diplomats and support personnel in danger in Tehran. These were 500,000 American soldiers. And if you look at the next 4 years of the war, another 20,000 or so were killed. So I began looking at that in part because it reflected on what happened in 1980. And interestingly, some of the same people who were involved in the 68 operation, including Nixon himself, had some hand in what happened in 1980. There were indications that he had been working. Nixon himself was sort of dealing with some of the CIA people who were helping out the Reagan campaign in 1980. But so if you go back to 68, what I was able to find on that several years back was that there was a file that was sort of stuck away in Johnson's presidential library in Austin, Texas, which the archivists called their X file. It was actually called the X envelope. Mm-hmm. And it was Walt Rostow, who had been National Security Advisor to Johnson's file, and Johnson had given him this file at the end of his presidency, and the file contained in it top secret material, the wiretaps that the FBI had placed on some of Nixon's operatives, the South Vietnamese embassy, the NSA also had information that they had from their intercepts in South Vietnam. So what you have is this remarkable body of evidence, which has now been mostly declassified. You also have the phone calls, which were declassified a bit earlier, maybe 8 years or so ago. And so you can actually now listen to Johnson having conversations with various Republicans and other people, and you have the documents that he was working from, essentially, what he knew at that time, because we have the paper too. So it's a remarkable overlay of information that that shows how this happened. And to get to your question about why did the Democrats allow it to happen, there's actually another interesting side story here. While this was playing out in the days before the election in 1968, again, a very close election. Humphrey was vice president. He was trying to succeed President Johnson. Nixon was obviously the Republican nominee. And in that time frame, there was a woman reporter, Beverly Deep, who was Christian Science Monitor's correspondent in Saigon. And she had gotten from her own sources there that from the South Vietnamese side, that they were working with Nixon to sabotage the Paris peace talks. And she filed the story. She filed the story to her editors back in the United States. They, in turn, gave it to their Washington bureau. And the Washington bureau guy shows up and starts asking questions about it. He goes to the South Vietnamese embassy, and he goes to the White House. The South Vietnamese don't want to talk. They basically shut him down. But Johnson seems like he wants to actually confirm this. But he has a conference call. And it's with
Clark Clifford, Dean Rusk,
yes,
and
Dean
Walt
Rusk.
Rostow.
Yes.
Rostow is there. These are like the men of the system, really.
Right.
You might call them. They're like all the paragons of the establishment at that point.
Yeah, they astonish me. Okay, no, sorry. Go on.
But so they have a conference call, and they basically agree to a point that Clark Clifford makes. Clifford says, "Well, what if we put this out and Nixon wins anyway? But it might destroy his presidency in the very beginning. It would be harmful to American interests. It would not be good for the country." Yeah. So their view became that it was better to stay silent, not confirm the story, not have it come out so the American people could know about this. And even if it meant Nixon winning, that was preferable to the possible alternative that they'd come out and Nixon might still win. But he'd be very badly damaged by the fact that the American people would realize that he had sabotaged peace talks and put 500,000 American soldiers in harm's way.
Yeah, and as you point out in your book, if they'd known that, they might have been a little more wary at the recurrence of this kind of lie. So among other things, it's not only tactically bizarre, but it's patronizing beyond belief. Like, the American people can't handle this. We have to keep it in our gentleman's club. Yes,
that's basically how they approached it. Now, it becomes interesting that this also then feeds into something else. Before, Nixon is then told by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that Johnson had this file, and the file is now missing. And at that time, no one really knew where it went. It had actually gone into Walt Rostow's home and into his personal desk, I guess, the so-called X envelope. And so Nixon knows that there's this file wandering around, and he sends Tom Houston out to find the file, and they go search through all the records, and they can't find the file. And this becomes increasingly sensitive to Nixon in 1971 when the Pentagon Papers are released by Daniel Ellsberg. So Ellsberg's releasing this history of the Vietnam War. But the history is really a history of going back to Truman and how it developed up through 1968. Mostly it's about Democratic presidents telling lies about Vietnam, although you can throw some Republican in there too, I suppose, but mostly Democrats. Now, what Nixon knows, and no one else does really, is that there's a sequel. There's a sequel to this, and I guess it's called the X envelope. It's the fact that, and Nixon knew what he did. He knew that he had been involved in sabotaging the peace talks, and he knew this document, this file, was wandering around someplace. So the first tapes that we know as the Watergate tapes are this rather confusing thing, which no one's ever put together, which is Nixon talking about a file and how they have to go find this file. And he even talks about they think it might be at Brookings Institution in Washington, so they're gonna raid the Brookings Institution. Nixon puts together a group we now know as the Plumbers. He gets E. Howard Hunt and these guys together, and they're going to go try to find this damn file. And so they even think about doing firebombing Brookings, because they thought that they'll firebomb Brookings. When the firemen show up, they'll sneak in with the firemen. They'll get to go through they'll blow the safe at Brookings and supposedly recover this file. So, in a way, we now can understand, based on this new material that's become available, is that the Watergate scandal comes out of this.
Because I'm old enough to remember again, and I remember one of the constant refrains in the earlier stages of Watergate is, "Come on, they're not that stupid. They wouldn't do this just to burglarize Larry O'Brien," or whatever his name was. But this gives the traditional element of motive in a very big way.
Right, and obviously we don't know exactly what. I think the motive may have changed. They were searching for all kinds of information. Once they got the team together, the team wasn't able to find this file. I don't know whether or not that was one of the things that they were checking off when they went into the Watergate in May, and then they were caught again the second time in June. But they were clearly trying to find other various kinds of information useful to Nixon. But they appear to have got their initial motivation out of trying to find this file. And if you put yourself back in that time period, and some of us lived through it, that if this had come out in 1971, when there were already massive demonstrations against the Vietnam War, if it had come out that President Nixon had extended the war for another 4 years for a political advantage, and all the destruction, the 20-some thousand American soldiers killed, but the million or so more Vietnamese killed, the destruction of the entire feeling inside this country about faith in the government, the turning of parents against kids over whether they should be sent to fight in Vietnam and so forth. Who knows what might have happened? I mean, it might have been impossible to protect Nixon if that had become known to the American people at that time. It would have was impeachment right at that point, if not something more dramatic.
That's the question I keep wanting to ask. Like, what were they thinking? I mean, LBJ was not known, as far as I know, as an overly soft politician, and yet you have a quote where he's calling Everett Dirksen, who was this old-time Midwestern Republican, saying, "Come on now, I played it clean," and LBJ can't have been deceived about Richard Nixon's nature or Spiro Agnew's nature or the nature of people like Charles Colson. He must have known what he was dealing with. And yet he seems to feel that some idea of keeping government's image pure is more important than letting 1 million people get killed.
Well, I think Johnson, from what I can gather from what I've been able to go through now, is that he was actually sincere about trying to end the war. He really did want to end the war, and he said that in March of 68 when he announced that he would not seek re-election. And most of us, I think, at the time didn't really believe him because at that point, a lot of people didn't believe anything that came out of Johnson regarding the war. But it does turn out that he was serious about that and was trying to do it, and was very upset at what Nixon did. In that one of the conversations with Dirksen, he says, "This is treason. What Nixon's doing is treason." So he wasn't confused about the seriousness of what he was facing, but he did agree, for the so-called good of the country, to keep this information hidden. He's angry. He also thinks that maybe after the election he can get Nixon to switch, but Nixon's already made the deal. Nixon's already cut the deal with President Tu of South Vietnam. So and Nixon feels he has to live up to that deal because maybe Tu might spill the beans otherwise. So Johnson goes into retirement and he gives this file to Rostow. And he tells Rostow, after I'm dead, you can decide what to do with this file. And so, and Johnson dies on January 22nd, 1973, 2 days after Nixon's second inaugural. And so then it falls to Rostow to figure out what to do with this. And he sort of thinks about it. And at this point, now we're in 1973, the Watergate scandal is beginning to spill out. John Dean has sort of gone public. The hearings are beginning into the Watergate scandal. Rostow, he doesn't get the full picture. He doesn't quite know exactly how Watergate ties into what happened in 68. But he does sense that there's a connection. He says because they got away with this in 68, they may have thought they could do whatever they wanted by 72. So he does see a link between these two seemingly separate operations, although we now it appears that they actually were somewhat connected, at least through Nixon's desire to find the file that Rostow has in his hands. So Rostow he goes through and he writes a memo to himself, which you can now read. The memo basically says, I think we should just keep this secret for 50 years. And so he sends it to the Johnson Library with the instructions that they keep it secret for 50 years. And then after 50 years, whoever is still around can open it up and then decide whether it should be hidden for another 50 years. So Rostow's idea is that we should go at least 50 years, maybe a century, before we get to see any of this stuff.
It sounds like a fairy tale detail, which makes sense because I keep not understanding the dissociation from reality. I
think these guys operate in a whole different planet in a way. But what happens is that so in the 1990s, the person running the LBJ library says, "Gee, Walt, I think maybe we should open this earlier than 50 years." So they do open it, and then they begin this long, arduous process of declassifying elements of it. So we now have it's now available to historians. And oddly, though, even after I wrote these stories and so forth, the New York Times continued not to believe them. Only recently, there was some scholar found some notes that Haldeman had left behind. Haldeman was the chief of staff for Nixon and had been involved in the campaign. And there was some cryptic notes that were Haldeman's taking down Nixon's instructions that relate to this effort to destroy the peace talks in 68. So finally, the New York Times, this is not that long ago, did an article saying, well, maybe this is true. So it's amazing how the major news organizations have abandoned their responsibility to the American people, much as the politicians do. You say it's hard to believe, hard to get around why these politicians would act this way. You also have to get around how the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post can be this way.
Right. And in fact, when you worked for Newsweek and you were trying to break Iran-Contra, one of your editors said, we have to keep this quiet for the good of the country or something, right?
Right. That was why I just gone to Newsweek at the time. This was like March of 1987. And Newsweek would have these fancy dinners with newsmakers. They'd usually be at Evan Thomas's house. He was the bureau chief, and he lived in Northwest Washington near Sibley Hospital. And so you have this sort of nice little get together, be catered. And this was like the first one I ever went to. And the guests, there were two guests that night. One was Dick Cheney, who was a congressman at the time, and he was going to be the chief Republican on the Iran-Contra congressional investigation, and Brent Scowcroft. And Brent Scowcroft had been part of the first investigation, the so-called Tower Report. There were three commissioners, and Scowcroft had been one of them. And they put out a report which I'd been sort of critical of because it seemed like they were still not really trying to get to the bottom of this at all. Anyway, so we're having dinner, and some of the top brass from New York had come down. And in the middle of the dinner, Scowcroft says, gee, if Admiral Poindexter, who had been the national security advisor for Reagan, had told the president about the diversion of the money from Iran to the Contras, Scowcroft said, I'd advise him to say that he hadn't. And I sort of dropped my fork and said, General, you're not suggesting that the admiral should commit perjury, are you? And there was like a sort of an embarrassed silence around the table. And the executive editor, Maynard Parker, who was sitting to my left, says in a booming voice, sometimes we have to do what's good for the country.
Oh, God.
And there was a lot of sort of manly guffawing around the table at that. I was being put down quite rather sternly for my impertinence. But so that was my introduction to how Newsweek viewed the news.
God.
And I had other sort of confrontations with this Newsweek bureaucracy. One time I was talking to the bureau chief Evan Thomas, who, is part of he was part of the ruling elite, you might say, Harvard. He part of a very prominent family, and I was talking about my view of journalism in one of our meetings in his office, and I said, well, in my view is we need to inform the American people so they can make the decisions. And he said, no, Bob, you got that wrong. Our job is to guide the American people. And I think that's how they viewed it. I think when you get to that level, they look at this as not empowering the unwashed public with information, but because that might cause too much trouble.
That's dangerous. Yeah,
it's dangerous. And so they are elitists. They're not. They don't believe in democracy as some of us who came from working class, middle class kind of backgrounds might think of it. They see it as their job is to pre-digest the food for the American people to chew on, and make sure it's not going to be too unsettling. And if it's really unsettling, like some of
the strangest thing,
drug trafficking by American clients, politicians who extend the length of wars or endanger American diplomats being held hostage. If it gets into that frame, then there's almost a unanimous approach to saying, well, the public really shouldn't hear all that. It's really not good for the country in their view of what's good for the country.
Well, they're protecting themselves as a class in a sense. I mean, they're saying if the public thinks that we're incompetent or dangerously sleazy or worse, then they might think we shouldn't be where we are right now at the top, ruling them. So we need to. I mean, I don't know what the hell the difference is between that and the sort of the perception management or whatever you'd call it that the Kremlin operates. And yet we're ready to practically go to war with Russia because their press is too compliant with the Kremlin or something. It's we pontificate with one hand and try and, tell other countries that they have to have this critical press, but then we have this, which is sort of, well, we can't upset the public too much. We gotta make sure they think things are running all right.
Right.
A lot
Except
of it
when they,
seems
I
to
guess
be
there,
based
probably,
on
there have been
timing.
times. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say a lot of it seems to be based on timings. Like, it was really interesting that you said in 1998 the CIA admits that. It's as if once the half-life of the story is done, there can be a little frankness, but not while it's live, not while it's radioactive. For example, you mentioned that a lot of the South Vietnamese who'd been involved in this act of treason, which it was, wrote their own memoirs or gave interviews saying, yeah, we did that. We absolutely did that. But I don't seem to remember that making a lot of news.
Right. There was a resistance from the major American news organizations to believing this. And in fact, they spent a great deal of time trashing it. There was even fairly recently, the New York Times was doing an article that was sort of looking at, I think it was after James Comey, the FBI director, came out with his last minute reopening and then reclosing of his investigation of Hillary Clinton's email server. And so the New York Times had a little sidebar which sort of dealt with other October surprises, and they included 68, but they included it erroneously. They said that the October surprise in 1968 was Johnson's suspension of the bombing of North Vietnam.
Wow.
So, in other words, they were still ignoring this. What at that point there was a huge body of evidence to confirm that the real October surprise in '68 was Nixon sabotaging the peace talks. And this was as recently as last year. Yeah. Now, as I say, in the last few months there was this discovery by this academic of these notes from Haldeman, and that seems to have tipped the New York Times into now saying, okay, yeah, it may well have happened. Yeah, but up to that point, despite all this evidence and all these documents and this had been building up over decades, the New York Times was still refusing to acknowledge it.
I remember the BBC did a story. It basically ripped you off a few years ago, and I guess that wasn't good enough for the New York Times, where they talked about, if I remember right, they even talked about the X envelope and then the whole Nixon treason story. They did a big long piece on it that was almost directly lifted from your work over the previous 10 years. And they may have cited you once in that. I can't remember now, but even that didn't shake awake the New York Times or the Post. I don't think.
Right, but I do think you also have to accept that there are people that are honest. That and I think in the case of the 1998 CIA report, the Inspector General Frederick Hitz was a person of some honesty, and he left the agency sort of after that and became a professor, I think, at Princeton. But I think he looked at the evidence and couldn't just whitewash it anymore. I think he just didn't want to whitewash it anymore. Probably he could have, but instead, he put it out. So I do think you have these moments where you have people who are part of the system, but also have integrity, and those moments should not be dismissed. I mean, they don't happen a lot, I'm afraid, but they do happen, and I think one has to sort of appreciate them when they do.
The thing that struck me about your account of all this is the absolutely consistent and effective behavior of Nixon's people that no one else seems to be willing to recognize. For example, the thing that really shocked me, maybe more than anything, is Haldeman says in 1973, when they're talking about the 1968 bugging, you don't really have to have hard evidence, Bob, Nixon tells Haldeman. You're not trying to take this to court. All you have to do is have it out. Just put it out as authority. I mean, and that's the way it seems to work. But
well, that was when Nixon was trying. Nixon during Watergate was trying to then put some of the blame onto Johnson. Right. It was an odd thing because Nixon was mad that he'd been bugged, and I guess it's similar to what we're hearing today, I suppose, from Trump. But Nixon was mad that he had been bugged, and even though the bugging related to something as severe as Nixon sabotaging the peace talks, Nixon still thought maybe he could go to Johnson with this and get Johnson to sort of tell the Democrats to stand down on the Watergate investigation, because Nixon was kind of saying, well, you bugged me too. And I bugged the Democrats, but you bugged me. So, and Johnson blew up at that. this was, it was shortly before Johnson died. I think it was a matter of a couple of weeks before he died. And Johnson was furious. May have contributed to his heart attack, but I'm sure it didn't help his blood pressure much. But he was quite furious that Nixon would play that card.
Yeah, after covering up for Nixon, this huge crime, Nixon comes to him and sees an angle and says, I'm going to rat you out as somebody who illegally bugged me, right? Unless you help cover up another crime I've done. And,
right.
Yeah, basically give him a heart attack for it. Yeah, it's pretty nasty.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of that old lyric that Trump quoted, "You knew damn well I was a snake before you let me in." But they don't seem to get that point.
Well, I think these guys are also they're all struggling. They're all under a lot of pressure. They're all trying to protect themselves from a whole bunch of enemies and make things happen. Being president of the United States is a very complicated endeavor, and I think these guys do behave in sort of odd ways at times, ways that I sometimes find hard to believe or understand. And that goes to the more present stuff, the work I was doing on, for instance, President Obama's 8 years. A man who comes in with promises to be the most transparent. I'm going to, transparent government. I'm going to give you the people the access to all this information. And then, over the next few years, and really then increasingly into the second term, he becomes one of the most secretive presidents ever. Hiding information that the American people really should know, and going after whistleblowers who shared important information with the public, going after them in ways that no other president has ever done. So you have people acting in strange ways, and sometimes you wonder what led them to that position. What were they sort of persuaded that this was good for the country? Were they intimidated by people who have greater power in certain ways than they may have? It's just hard to know what leads some of these people to take the decisions they do.
Right. Yeah.
So, if I can shift this a little bit, John, if that's all right, I want to go. I want to go to a couple of these stories that you tell that about how some other journalists' careers who were investigative journalists and critical and adversarial towards the government, how their careers and lives were destroyed. We've talked about Gary Webb, but some of these stories that you retell in your book very well because you were there, including what was done to your October surprise reporting. I mean, it literally has me hitting the walls, so angry, and it kind of hits me personally knowing what's happened to some of my better stories and the sleazy pushback. But the first story I want to ask you about, if you could tell our listeners about Raymond Bonner. I remember even way back when I first got to know you and first started writing for you a little bit, you were telling me about how Raymond Bonner's, because he was one of the lead New York Times reporters on the Bank of New York scandal in 1999, about all the Russian and IMF money that was stolen out of Russia through the Bank of New York, and Bonner was on it. And you were telling me, how happy you were that his career was. I didn't know that whole backstory to Raymond Bonner. So if you could, can you recount that story? Because they kind of crossed over into your territory as well in your early reporting.
Right. I think the Raymond Bonner story is a bit like the missing link between what happened in the 70s when the Washington Post and the New York Times are still living on that sort of heyday of being tough journalists. They were willing to stand up to Nixon ultimately. And some of that continued on through the 70s. Where there was more of a skeptical approach by the major news media toward government and power. And then that really changes at the very beginning of the Reagan years. Reagan was well liked by a lot of people in the news business. Catherine Graham, who I later worked for when she owned Newsweek at the time I was there. She liked the Reagans. She really loved them. They were like Hollywood royalty, and that was quite impressive to her. So you started seeing this shift, and plus there was a lot of a backlash, if you will, against the 60s and 70s. There was a cultural backlash by some of the people who were older, who were publishers, who were running news organizations. They were more from the World War II generation, and they'd never liked what happened in the 60s. They didn't like the fact that the young people were more unwilling to be shipped off to a war. So there was a lot of that sort of generational kind of cultural hostility toward what had been happening in journalism in that period. And so you get into the 80s, and the Reagan people were extremely sophisticated in how they approached controlling the message, controlling the media. We now know the documents that you can find at the Reagan Library, some new ones I just actually got a few weeks ago, show that there were there were multi-agencies that were brought in to the National Security Council, and they worked together on how to do what they called perception management. They realized that what was really needed was to at some point get the American people back in line, because the American people were kind of out of control in the 70s. There was not just the anti-war demonstrations, but there was this tremendous distrust of what the government was saying, feelings that the CIA had gotten out of control, and that the American people wanted to know more and wanted to be more resistant to some of this behavior. So there was a strategy put together in the early 1980s to whip the American press corps back into line, and to gradually bring the American people more into line as well, so there would not be resistance to future military operations abroad. They called it kicking the Vietnam syndrome. That was the phrase they used. They needed to figure out ways to get the American people to, quote, kick the Vietnam syndrome. And so Ray Bonner was at that time a reporter for the New York Times in Central America, and he was reporting courageously and accurately on the death squad operations that the U.S.-backed regimes were carrying out there. This was like a Holocaust in Central America. There was, of course, the Guatemalan intelligence services. They were slaughtering people in Guatemala. It even reached the point of genocide, according to one of the human rights investigations later. In El Salvador, the military-backed government there was taking people out in the streets and murdering them quite regularly, including American church women who were raped and then murdered, and just before Reagan took office. And there was a real targeting especially of the Catholic priests who were promoting social justice in the region. So Bonner was covering this and reporting about these death squad operations, and it was something that the Reagan people wanted to suppress. They did not want those stories out because it was hard to get the American people in Congress to go along with sending weapons to these different governments if they were known to be complicit in these horrible atrocities. So Raymond Bonner had to be taken out, and he did a very important story of a massacre that occurred at a town called El Mozote, where several hundred, possibly as many as 1,000 men, women, and children were taken out and butchered by the Salvadoran military, the Atlacat Battalion, which was the first of the Salvadoran battalions trained by the U.S. military. And they were basically doing an extermination campaign in areas that were considered pro-rebel, pro-guerrilla. Similar things were going on in Guatemala. This all had to be suppressed. So the way to do it was to discredit the journalists who were writing the stories, and so Bonner came under heavy attack.
Bonner's front page in the New York Times on the El Mozote massacre. It came out one day before the Reagan administration certified that El Salvador had passed, that they'd improved their human rights record, that they had the army under control, right, and that was needed to get more money to give them arms and training, right? So,
right, and even and some of the people that we now know more about, we would now call them the neoconservatives. They were important players in this phase. Elliot Abrams, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, was one of the people going up to give testimony on how the how the Salvadoran military was respectful of human rights. So you had this. The beginnings of this, what they call perception management. They were trying to control the perceptions of the American people. So they had to then shut down those honest, courageous journalists who were out in the field on the scene, reporting truthfully. And Bonner became a key target. At the time, there also were a lot of the right-wing media was not what we know of it today, but you were starting to see like the Washington Times was going. There were anti-media attack groups like Accuracy in Media.
And if I recall, the young Bill O'Reilly claimed to have been at El Mozote, but he didn't see anything. He mentions that in one of his memoirs, and I checked it out, and he never reported a word about it.
Right, and ultimately it was all confirmed. By the way, the UN went in. And it's amazing that it was kept in doubt for so long. But at the end of the war, I think sort of early 1990s, almost a decade later, the UN went in and dug up the skeletons, including the skeletons of children. There were the kids were sort of locked in a building, and they were burned alive by the Al-Aqat battalion. So it was a very grisly situation. But the key role for the right-wing press, they were trying to protect Reagan's flanks, was to claim it didn't happen and to attack the journalists who reported on it. And ultimately, Abe Rosenthal, who was the executive editor of the New York Times at that point, summons Bonner back to New York and sticks him in some corner office doing some business kind of stuff. And
which is a way of discrediting him. I mean,
basically discrediting him, making it appear that he's been taken back because he's a failed journalist. Yeah. And Bonner then resigns from the New York Times.
I mean, that's for people who don't know or aren't maybe in the profession. If that is really the same thing as saying, as the New York Times essentially acknowledging that the Reagan administration was right, that Bonner had made it up, or that he was too sympathetic to the communists, which was what they were claiming about him. Right? I think the Wall Street Journal had posted a huge editorial attacking him as basically a communist dupe. And so when you recall him like that, I mean, Bonner can't even argue it anymore because people would say, well, even your own newspaper, brought you back in. You've no credibility anymore.
Right. The idea that your own newspaper is going to back you up is one of the great myths of journalism.
Yes.
We've seen over and over again. Often, in the case, also, if you go a later case, very similar case is the case of that we've talked about, in terms of various, the news organizations often will tell you that your editors will say, we don't want to really go that direction with you. They're under corporate pressure too. They have their bosses. Gary Webb, for instance, was betrayed by the San Jose Mercury News editor, who was under pressure from Knight Ridder, the parent corporation, because Knight Ridder was reading all this stuff in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times trashing Webb, and they chose to believe that over Webb. So then they put pressure on Webb's editors, and they folded because they needed to protect their own careers.
Right.
So the idea that you're going to have this sort of Lou Grant kind of editor who's going to be tough and crusty and stand behind his people, it's kind of a myth.
It's one of these cultural myths that. And everybody's still working off Watergate, as if that's the rule rather than the exception, especially the media, the way the media kind of portrays itself as this great principled protectors of us. I mean, it would be worse without them. There's no doubt, but they're so complicit so often. It's there's another story you retell in one of your earlier books, Lost History, Contra-cocaine, the press, and Project Truth. And this is something else. Project Truth was another thing that the Reagan administration launched. It was very similar to the hysteria today about Kremlin disinformation, Kremlin active measures, subverting American democracy. Reagan's answer was Project Truth, and to fact check Soviet propaganda and all this stuff. But you write also in the book about how NPR, which is not known as as sort of the the wildest muckraking operation out there. NPR came under heavy fire from Reagan people, from Otto Reich, who headed up the Office of Public Diplomacy. I think it was a new office. Public diplomacy is basically another term, one of those dull Washington terms for perception management. And so they ran one of their radio segments from the point of view of Nicaraguan villagers who were massacred, and didn't let didn't give enough voice to the Contras who massacred them. I don't know. And Reich called up screaming at, I think it was a foreign editor, Paul Allen, if I remember right, from your book, and saying, this is one-sided and this is communist propaganda, and I demand a meeting with you. And he comes to the office, NPR office, and he's got some little henchman next to him who actually reads out the number of minutes NPR has devoted to anti-Contra viewpoints, and starts screaming at him, berating him, and Paul Allen winds up getting forced out, and he's out of a job and out of journalism within a year.
Yeah, that's how they had teams. They had teams of people they would send around to your editors to try to badmouth you, and the editors often were intimidated. They were these important people from the State Department would come over, and they'd pound their fists and offer those kinds of criticisms, and the editors usually just didn't want to be bothered, and they'd be frightened, or they, in a case like Paul Allen did actually support his people, defended their reporting, which was a good story, and but then the higher up at NPR got rid of him. So if your editors do back you up, they may well end up on the street too. So that's the reality. But one of the interesting people that came out of that that operation that Otto Reich ran was Robert Kagan.
Right. That's
Robert
right.
Kagan was actually replaced Otto Reich. He was another one of the young neocons. There was an entire generation of young neocons that were getting credentialed at that time. So you had Elliot Abrams, you had one of his proteges, Robert Kagan, who then is running this public diplomacy office after Reich leaves. And they learned the tools of the trade. And the tools of the trade were actually being taught to them by a guy named Walter Raymond, who had been the top person in CIA covert operations. And he was moved from the CIA. He was a specialist in propaganda, and he was moved from the CIA to the National Security Council to work on the staff there. And he organized these multi-agency, interagency task forces to develop techniques for doing the propaganda, getting control of the American public, getting control of the media. And they used the techniques that had been developed by the CIA in dealing with hostile countries, and they just applied them domestically. And of course, the CIA is not supposed to be allowed to do that. But by taking the CIA guy and putting him at the National Security Council, they felt they got around that.
Didn't he formally resign from the CIA?
He did resign, but he was there for a while as CIA. But the point was, it's kind of a
it doesn't matter. I'm just saying
relevant point because whether you're technically CIA or you're just former CIA teaching the same techniques, it amounts to the same thing.
Of course,
but that's how they sort of technically got around it. They did something very similar with the Contra program. The CIA was forbidden from helping the Contras by Congress at one point, so they just moved things over to the National Security Council under Ollie North. So the same MO was being used in terms of their propaganda system as it was with actually getting arms to the Contras.
One thing that struck me about the way you described this repression within the journalistic profession is how soft a lot of it is. You said that after you were breaking Iran-Contra stories, you were mocked even in the style section of the Washington Post. What did they find to mock in the style section?
Well, was my first week at Newsweek. My first week at Newsweek, things weren't going well even from the beginning, but I was able to find out, based on sources inside the White House, that there was panic that because Reagan was implicated in these operations, that it could lead to his impeachment. And so the word went out from Don Regan, who was the then chief of staff, that they were going to have to rally around and find scapegoats and protect the presidency. And so that story, we had very good sourcing on it. It actually was the cover for Newsweek that week. They did a fairly serious, looking cover, black and white, with Reagan and some of the language about we have to protect the president. And so they put it out. My first week there, they put it out. It was the lead story, and it came under fierce attack because at that point the positions of the Washington Post was that, oh, this was just a bunch of the so-called rogue operatives, that Reagan didn't know anything about any of it, that it was all being done by a couple people in the closets at the White House, and so forth. That was what they did. So in the style section, they did this piece mocking Newsweek, mocking me. Well, not sure my name was in there, but they mocked our story, calling it overheated, excessive. Of course, it turned out to be 100% true, but that doesn't ever factor into this stuff.
So it was like a style critique.
So effective in terms of scaring the Newsweek editors. Remember, Washington Post and Newsweek at that time were in the same company. That Evan Thomas went around the office, because usually they had past copies of Newsweek lying around. So if you came into the office, you could pick one up and read it. He went around and made sure that one issue was destroyed. So he didn't want anyone to see it. It was so embarrassing to them. And they made it clear to me that I'd embarrassed them.
God forbid you should be mocked. I mean, Jesus.
So that's the kind of effect it has. And so from the very beginning, even though as I was advancing the Iran-Contra story, Newsweek didn't want it. And they made it very clear to me they didn't want it. By the fall of we're now in 1987. By the fall of 87, when the congressional report came out, Evan Thomas came to me and said, "I have instructions from New York that you're not to read the report."
Jesus.
Oh. And I said, "But hold it, Evan. It's going to be a big story. Everyone's going to have stories on this." And he said, "Well, if you could get something that's not in the report, maybe we could do that." And I said, "Well, how should I know what's not in the report if I ordered not to read the report?" And they were sending me off on some silly trip to, do some silly investigation they wanted. So of course, I took the report with me and read it because I know it was against the rules, but I did. But they were so hostile that when we get to 1989, when Oliver North is put on trial, we're forbidden to cover the trial. Newsweek had nobody assigned to the trial because they didn't want it to be a story. They just did not want it to continue as a story. They hated the story. It undermined the sense of how good the Reagan administration was and so forth. So everyone else was kind of covering the trial. It was like a front page story, and every day, as it was still a big story, whether Newsweek wanted it to be or not. So I knew I'd get blamed for that too. So I arranged, at the time, Federal News Service was kind of a new thing. So I arranged to have them get me the daily transcripts of the trial. And so every night about midnight or so, some guy would come by on a motorcycle to my house and deliver the day's transcripts. And it was obviously, so we were a bit behind the curve, but it turned out that the transcript included the bench conferences, which you couldn't hear if you were in the courtroom. So I began to break stories from the bench conferences, things that the judge was saying to about some of the different players. And I was sneaking them into the Periscope section, which was sort of this little, brief story kind of section.
I remember.
At that time, it was sort of, late breaking stories. You might be able to get into the Periscope section. And they got more and more angry at me because they didn't want these stories. So, it became clear that there was I had no future with them. And so that we agreed on a parting of the ways. They didn't really want me and I didn't want them. So that's when I left in June of 1990.
And was that when you went to work with Frontline? I don't know if you were working with anybody else at the time.
PBS Frontline contacted me, and because of the Iran-Contra work, they were interested in seeing if there was anything to the so-called 1980 October surprise issue. And although I knew a bit about it at that point, I certainly, because some of the sources and some of the information was going back in that direction to being to Reagan's not having started it in 85, 86, but having started it in 81. So there were always these questions, and there were some witnesses who were making allegations. But I wasn't really interested in doing it because I knew I'd been beaten up a lot by this point, and I don't want it to sound like I'm sort of trying to be a hero or anything, but frankly, I was trying to think of how I could make a living to support my family, and I knew that continuing on that kind of journalism was going to be very problematic. It was clear by that point that none of this stuff was desired by anybody. But I thought also, since PBS had come to me, and I shouldn't turn it down. So I agreed to work on it, and basically they gave me a producer, a really good producer, Robert Ross, who was also kind of freelancing at that time. And they had then high-8 cameras. They had those were considered very high tech at the time. You could do filming in rather low light, and so we went off to talk to people into Europe, the Middle East, Iran, Tunisia. Went to different places to interview players in Israel. We were there for a while, tracking down information. So we ended up putting together a lot of very valuable material, which pointed in the direction that the Reagan people had interfered with Carter's hostage negotiations. The documentary was fairly wasn't as conclusive as I might have done it today, but we're still working with we're still trying to piece it all together. But it was a very interesting body of work that we put together, and unless you want to believe that, again, a couple dozen people are all getting together to lie, including people who seem to have no connections to each other, you kind of have to believe that there was something that happened. And I think that's where the evidence is now pointing. But again, because we were attacked aggressively when that was put out in 1991, the Congress did a really bad investigation. They were very much intimidated by the pressure. At that point, George H.W. Bush was president, and he was making very clear that he was not going to tolerate this sort of thing. And one of the most amazing aspects of that investigation was that the Congress, in this case, mostly Congressman Lee Hamilton, who was a sort of a moderate conservative Democrat, that Hamilton basically asked the White House to run the investigation. So they were asking basically George H.W. Bush and his people to investigate themselves. And so
who was Hamilton? I mean, he always seemed like the perfect opposition guy. I mean, again, put it back in the Russian context, there'd be this sort of very, very pliant kind of opposition-y party, and then the leader of the party, but a very, very loyal opposition. And that's kind of how they wanted it. And he just seemed like he would fit perfectly into that system.
Right. And so basically the Bush people actually went around searching for the documents that might bear on this issue of whether the then president had been involved in a kind of a treasonous act. And we now know, at least I was able to find an interesting document at the Bush Library in one of the files of the White House counsel's office, where someone at the State Department has reports that he's located proof that William Casey, who was in 1980 was Reagan's campaign chairman, and of course later became the CIA director, but that Casey had been in Madrid, Spain, in connection with the October surprise issue. And that was one of the major allegations, was that Casey had met with some Iranians in Madrid. And that was informed, and the White House counsel's office was informed of this. But it never got to Congress.
And it seems like Congress didn't want to know by that point anyway.
Yeah, and they didn't really care. They were mostly at that point just trying to go through the motions of having done an investigation and just say really nothing happened. But in effect, it was almost worse than not doing anything,
yes.
because once so let's assume that the Bush people found evidence that that Bush was guilty, they would most likely just destroy it. Mm-hmm. You're asking them to essentially put them all themselves out of a job. At that point in 91, 92, Bush is running for re-election. He thought he could win. He didn't want to have something like this come out. So to expect that the White House, I mean, it's sort of bizarre if you think about it, that with all this power and money that goes with controlling the U.S. government, that Lee Hamilton would think that they'd be all gentlemen and simply
exactly.
confess, yes, we got us. Yes, here's the evidence we found.
Shucks, drats, you got us.
Well, see, that goes right back to what I asked about Nixon. How could sane-seeming, cold-blooded politicians like LBJ think that Nixon would be a gentleman and think that all Nixon's people would be gentlemen? And how could the same party go on thinking that and getting kicked in the face for 30 years unless they were colluding in some way?
Well, Lee Hamilton, I think, built his whole reputation on being this wise man, very moderate, someone who could be trusted, who wouldn't push the envelope too much. He came from a rather conservative district in Indiana. So I think it makes every bit of sense in the world. If he became elevated into being a wise man, the person you turn to whenever there's a major event you need to have investigated. I happen to agree with a lot of the stuff he did on the 9/11. I know people get mad at me for basically thinking that they got that right, but but that's the sort of thing Hamilton is turned to be the man of the system. So it works tremendously well for him. He became head of the Wilson Center in Washington. So if you're a bomb thrower, if you're say the opposite, let's say if he had been a real hard ass investigator and had gone in and gone toe to toe with President Reagan or President George H.W. Bush, he would have a very different reputation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He'd be considered kind of a nut, maybe Dennis Kucinich. They would have marginalized him like they do.
Right.
That's how it works.
And his personality and constitution, he wouldn't be able to handle that. So he wants to be an inside player, right? So the personality does matter.
Sure.
And the politics
it does in these cases.
Yeah. Let me ask you something else too related to this then, which we're kind of getting at, which is, I mean, and again, we've talked about this on the show, in the 70s, it was almost like a kind of, because of the failure of the Vietnam War and then Nixon going down, there was a period of it was like a glasnost, almost where everything was kind of opened up for a while and then everything closed up again after a few years, and the Democrats were much more active for a time opposition, and before that in the Cold War they were a lot more, muscular, I guess you would say. And how much? So, we talked about the Reagan administration's very concerted and complex and effective efforts to rein in the media and beat them down into submission. How much of that was applied to the Democrat Party? I mean, nowadays, I don't think anybody really expects the Democrat Party to stand up for anything anymore. I mean, except maybe to get a few better benefits on the margins. But I think people had much higher expectations of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party in the 70s, at least, through the early 80s, and that just was gone by the end of the Reagan years. Did they do the same thing to a lot of sort of more vocal opposition Democrats?
Yes, I think if you look at what those documents show from the so-called public diplomacy or perception management operations, they weren't just aimed at the journalists or more broadly at the public. They were aimed at troublesome members of Congress. They would figure out what themes. They would talk in these terms of, well, what theme might be good for a certain district. If, say, it's a heavily Catholic district, they'd work on some Catholic theme. Or if it's a lot of Jewish voters, they'd work on some, the Sandinistas are anti-Semitic. And they would work on various themes that would then put the congressmen or senators in a difficult spot. And you'd start seeing being faced with that kind of allegation that would be sort of ginned up in many cases against like a target like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. That the congressmen would be under such pressure that they'd have to start backing away. Someone like Mike Barnes, for instance, who was in a suburban district in Maryland, when the Reagan people concocted the anti-Semitic theme, which the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua itself had disavowed, said it's not true. They said that the Sandinistas were not anti-Semitic, that they had, there were prominent Jewish people in the government, and the Jews who had fled were people who were close to Somoza. So it wasn't that they were being persecuted because they were Jewish; it was just because of their associations with Somoza. But even when the embassy was saying it wasn't true, it was still put out as the theme because it was a very effective theme. Because if you call someone anti-Semitic, that's a very serious charge, and it should be. So anyway, so they did that. They put out that theme. And Mike Barnes decided he had to, for his career, denounce the Sandinistas for being anti-Semitic. Because otherwise, what are you being? You being a Sandinista sympathizer? Right. So that sort of baiting went on for members of Congress too, and they were weakened. And plus, you have to remember that in the 1980 election, it wasn't just that Reagan beat Carter. It was that after Carter had failed to get the hostages out, and his presidency had sort of crumbled over that failure. Some of the best Democrats, or at least the most aggressive Democrats, let's say, were also driven out of Congress. They also lost their elections. So by the time you get to the early 80s, the McGoverns, the Churches, the Bayes, all these folks are gone. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the people who had made a name for themselves trying to rein in parts of the U.S. government and the CIA side, or with the military-industrial complex side, or the Vietnam War side, had been essentially knocked out of the box. They weren't here anymore. Mm-hmm. So you had, and a lot of those folks also, a number of them also go back to the days of the New Deal. Mm-hmm. They came out of the Great Depression. They understood how politics could actually play a much more direct role in the lives of people. The crowd you start getting in the 1980s is a very different group of Democrats. They're much more oriented toward money. They need money to sort of run campaigns. They stop being people who are sort of strong labor people, because labor unions have gotten weaker by this point. Reagan does a lot to break down the unions in the 80s. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of reasons, the Democrats sort of have to reinvent themselves. And they kind of reinvent themselves as Bill Clinton, mm-hmm. in a way. This idea of taking pro-corporate positions, being a little bit more reasonable maybe than some of the Republicans, not quite as aggressive in going after certain things, but they were for deregulations. So there was a lot of similarity between Republican policies and Democratic policies as we move into toward the present. And a lot of that breaking down occurs right around that point of the late 70s, early 80s, when where a lot of things shift, and a lot of our impressions are still locked into the 70s, mm-hmm. Because we think of the Democrats and Republicans kind of going at it over Watergate, or that we think of the Washington Post and the New York Times, going against the government and exposing wrongdoing. That hasn't happened for a long, long time, really. Mm-hmm. We're in a different situation today because the major papers hate Donald Trump so much that they've made themselves almost caricatures of just going after a political target. But it's a different thing. They're in a sense trying to reflect the establishment. They become really much the establishment, and if they see something threatening to the establishment, they sort of go after it, mm-hmm. almost like they're white cells going after some invasive blood problem. So, yeah. And that's how I think how one should see them and understand them at this point. They're not, and in some ways, even in the 70s, when part of the reason they went after Nixon at the Washington Post was that Katharine Graham didn't like Nixon. Yeah. Ben Bradley didn't like Nixon.
No, well, he had no class. And I saw something very similar quoted, I think, in Vanity Fair, where the guy, Graydon Carter, if that's his name, who edits Vanity Fair, said Trump is often seen wearing an open suit coat under an open overcoat. And I thought, Okay. I used to own a suit coat. Where's the crime? But apparently, you're supposed to think of that as a serious crime. And it seems like there would be a few million Trump crimes that would count a little more heavily than that. But that appears to be the big sin.
Right. But, this is also something that was not that it was new, but it's something that they learned from the CIA when the CIA understood that what you do is you personalize your attacks. And I had a very interesting interview once with Miles Copeland, who was one of the CIA guys who was involved in the Iran operation in 1953. And he said one of the things that they would do is they would go after Mossadegh because of how he dressed. And I guess Mossadegh would wear a cape, but they turned it into a bathrobe. They'd wander around in a bathrobe, and they make him seem like a laughable, befuddled character. And so, as part of what they were doing inside Iran was to spread that kind of story. Now, if you jump toward the 1980s, you have Ronald Reagan deciding that they had to make Danny Ortega, the leader of Nicaragua, into that kind of a figure. So they would do things about corruption, and some might be even true a little bit. Or Danny Ortega he wore designer glasses. Now I don't know what's wrong. I mean, it's hard not to wear designer glasses these days because if you go to an optometrist, most of the options you have are some kind of designer glasses. But this was made into a big deal in the 1980s that Ortega was the dictator in designer glasses. Here's Ronald Reagan, whose wife would get these free designer gowns that were worth, hundreds, tens of thousands of dollars. But so they just create that sort of thing. And we've seen it going forward. I mean, the demonizing of foreign leaders. And you do it somewhat with domestic people too, although it's a little trickier because most domestic people can probably fight back a little easier. But you still see it. You saw it with what happened with, say, Gary Webb, turning him into a joke, a laughing stock.
A kook.
But you see it with Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad or Muammar Gaddafi, and Vladimir Putin doesn't wear a shirt. He didn't wear a shirt when he went riding once, or whatever it was that we keep going back to. So there's a way of sort of making fun of these people, and I think I think that has sort of permeated the system. So instead of us trying to be sort of serious, you can seriously go after what some of these people do. But it's more powerful or punchy or effective if you make it sort of something personal, something that I guess the average person can kind of grab onto, not some policy. You're talking about Noriega waving a machete or something, Putin not wearing a shirt. You say, okay, well, so what? Really, when you get down to it, so what? But we make it into sort of an emblem of why this person should be laughed at and disdained and hated, and that
or should be approved of. Like I remember when George W. Bush was somebody you could have a beer with, or as you point out, when Caspar Weinberger, Reagan's sort of grand vizier, was at risk of being put on trial. Richard Cohen of the Washington Post chimed in by saying, I saw Weinberger at the grocery store, and he was pushing his own grocery cart as if that were proof of virtue.
Right. I push my own grocery cart, and no one thinks I'm virtuous because of that. But yeah, that's right. I mean, so it becomes, yes, you can get these totally irrelevant things. And in this whole world we now live in, they become emblematic of something. But that's how it works, and that's something that in a way it's been sort of passed down. And not that it's entirely. I'm not saying the CIA invented all these things. Obviously, they didn't. But this way of, but it's something they were kind of refined. And I've talked to some people like Lansdale, and so one of the founders of the whole psyops world. And the way they talk about these things, it's part of a process that they understand. And how they get people to believe things. Lansdale once told me, he said that the key thing is when you're putting out your propaganda, you don't want to put it out in some publication that is perceived to be controlled. You want to put it out in some publication that's perceived to be independent, because then the public will be more receptive to it. So if the government's just saying something, they'll have their defenses up. But if you can sort of pretend like it's an independent journalist who you control, but they don't know you control him, then that's much more effective because the public's defenses are down. So these people think in these ways.
What's interesting is that Mark and I talked at length about a popular novel of the 1970s, I think, called The Spike. And
by
so
Arnaud de Bourgegrave and Robert Moss.
Yeah, the guy who ended up editing the Washington Times. Yeah. So much of what you describe is basically the right-wing Spike. But as if out of bad conscience or something, in the novel The Spike, it's communist editors quashing anti-communist stories, and this becomes a big spy novel plot.
Right. I think there's it's. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I don't know all that. I know that a lot of what I read from the Reagan files is about them using the phrase moral equivalence. And there's a lot about how the Russians, the Soviets were doing these disinformation things, very similar to what you're hearing today, really, about RT. That somehow the Russians are putting out all this false material and our stuff is sort of countering it. So, in other words, the presentation is that this is a case of defensive handling of spreading your own propaganda in a defensive way. They started it. We're just doing it now to protect ourselves.
Right.
But the reality is that the United States has been aggressive in these areas for a very long time, and to pretend otherwise is just to ignore history. It was the CIA that was doing this in '53 in Iran, and in '54 in Guatemala. They're using false information. They were putting out stories. In the case of Guatemala, they had a radio station that was describing this huge army that was heading into Guatemala City, which was basically a fiction, but it was enough to spread panic through Guatemala City and lead to the overthrow of our Benz. So the idea that this is something only that the bad guys do and we're just the virtuous ones is simply nonsensical. But it's reached that point that if you make the point I'm just making, you're attacked. You're called, this case you'd be called a Moscow stooge or something, because they have all these phrases. So people that just try to be honest are then smeared too. Yeah. And that's the great danger. And that to me is really the greatest danger of all of this. And it's sort of why I ended up in the mid-90s sort of starting consortiumnews.com was I didn't want to play the game anymore. I just wanted to do my job the way it was supposed to be done. And so instead of having to try to cajole editors and producers to kind of let me do some good, half decent work,
and to stick by you,
they were scared.
Yeah.
And I also felt guilty because I'd get them into positions where they would end up coming under lots of pressure because they backed me for a bit before they maybe pulled away. So there was a very ugly set of relationships that come out of this that I didn't want to do anymore. But the trouble, of course, with trying to start your own place is you have to start your own place. And as Mark can vouch, it's not always easy.
No,
you've got to figure out how you're going to raise money, how you're going to do all the work that comes with this kind of job. And you're not anyone's heard of anymore. You're not calling from the New York Times or the Washington Post or Newsweek or something. You're calling from some website that no one knows exists. So there's a huge number of challenges that go with this. I'm not saying it was anything is easy about this, but that was the point. I just did not want to have to play those games anymore. And I wanted to be able to do journalism as I thought it should be done, tell the truth the best I could, and work with other people who had the same goal, and edit them and help them make their stories more effective and stronger, and not be afraid and sort of operate without fear. Although I have to say I still have fear when I do stories. I mean, I know this story is going to get me attacked, and I don't like to go through all that. No, who does, right?
Yeah.
You're going to be called names. You're going to be smeared, and that of course still happens. But the whole point of having, for how many years it's been now, since 1995, starting Consortium News, it was a way to sort of just do the stories, just get the information and get it out in ways that people might understand and read and appreciate. But but not have to sort of go through all the endless negotiations with people above me to try to, somehow sneak something through or somehow maneuver to get something out that is good, strong journalism, but they know, and I know is going to cause a lot of grief.
And also, you don't have to worry about getting sold out by your editor and having your credibility ruined just because the editor or the publisher didn't want to deal with the pressure from somebody else powerful, which I've had to deal with since I lost the Exile at some publications. So I know exactly what you're talking about. When I had the Exile, I didn't have to worry about that. Yeah, what you do worry about is your credibility, but that's between you, basically you and your readers and the public. What I found after having come out here was when I stuck my neck out too far in some stories, my editor or magazine or whatever wouldn't always stand by me, and all they have to do is walk away from you once. I had probably the biggest scoop of my time destroyed because I and Yasha Levine, we broke the story in February of 2009 that the Tea Party, it was the very first early Tea Party protest, that it was funded by these oligarchs, the Koch brothers, who I'd never heard of. We did this for Playboy magazine. I didn't even think it was a big deal story because to me it just looked like a typical oligarch propaganda operation in Russia. I didn't realize this was something that was going to get really huge, but Playboy, suddenly the story blew up big, and Rick Santelli turned down his appearance on The Daily Show, and New York Times wrote something up, and so we wound up getting just savagely attacked by Megan McArdle at the Atlantic Monthly and somebody at New York Magazine, a couple others calling us conspiracy theorists, and this stuff doesn't happen here. And Playboy pulled the story. And that's all that needs to happen. When they pull the story, your credibility is ruined. And and so your scoop is ruined. And, that was my first real experience with, and I didn't even realize it was a big story until, after the shitstorm hit. And it's frustrating as hell. So at least when you're doing your own thing, you don't have to worry about other people losing their nerve or for whatever sleazy reasons that they destroy your credibility. You destroy it on your own or you don't, at least when you run your own operation, right?
Right. The other odd thing is that even when your stories are ultimately confirmed, if that happens, sometimes it takes forever. But, eventually maybe some document comes out years later. No one goes back and fixes it.
Yes.
It's not like they say, "Oh, remember we trashed that guy and it turned out he was right." That's not how it works. And there was a quote I had from some guy who worked for the New Republican Newsweek back in when I did my first book, Fooling America, where he said, "In Washington, there's no honor in being right too soon." And that's sort of true. If you're right too soon, people just remember you're out of step and crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then later, if it's decided, oh yes, that is true, the heavy hitters, the big shots will sort of go around it, but they won't go back and say, oh, remember this the guy we made fun of for months or years, he had it first. So you're stuck in a situation.
In fact, there was a truism, I think, after the Iraq invasion went bad, that no one was punished for being wrong about the invasion. They were punished for being right. And I remember when we started the War Nerd project, it took off in a way I never expected. And I was saying, based on everything I knew, that the invasion would go bad. But at the same time, I knew if I could just use the sort of dirtbag California prose that people like when I'm writing this stuff as a military pedant and take a patriotic Tom Clancy approach on this, I might be incredibly rich. I couldn't do it, but not so much out of virtue, just out of snobbery. It's like I happen to know a little about insurgency, and I know this will go badly. And in a typical pedant way, it was more important to say that than to get rich. Well, to be honest, it also made me feel a little queasy to think of doing that. But
yeah, I think there is this whole point of putting people at their lives at risk just for careers, which is something that people in Washington do all the time. And it is shocking how it turns out that the old saying, there's safety in numbers, is true. That if you run with the pack and you're 100% wrong along with the rest of them, basically nothing happens to you. If you're off doing something on your own and you're 100% right or 99% right or something, you can be taken out and destroyed. Look what happened to Gary Webb. So you have this phenomenon of that, and this I think is a very crucial point, that there was another possible turning point in journalism that occurs in 2003 and 2004 when it becomes clear that the Iraq war was sold under false pretenses, that all these folks, and it wasn't just the neoconservatives, it was also, remember, the liberals. It was Remnick, and it was Keller, and it was
Jonathan Chait, and a lot of these guys.
So Friedman, all these folks, all this sort of smart liberal types jumped on board because they knew it was smart for their careers, or maybe they were just stupid enough to believe this nonsense, but they did. And so when it all comes apart, and this was frankly, when the CIA and others were doing the investigation into the WMD, I thought they would just sort of plant some WMD and say, "See, we found it." I mean, that's how I thought it was going to go down, because that's how it often works. But they didn't. They actually, again, this was a case where there was some honesty, and they reported that it was all bullshit and that it was wrong, and that and so it turned out that the truth kind of finally came out. But the weird thing was that, with very few exceptions, maybe one or two, nobody got punished who had put out the false stories. In fact, many of them got rewarded. Mm-hmm. Fred Hyatt at the Washington Post, who was the editorial page editor back then, writing as flat fact that Saddam was hiding weapons of mass destruction. He's still the editorial page editor of the Washington Post. Nothing happened to him. Bill Keller actually was promoted after joining with the doves who became hawks. Remember, he did a famous piece about that.
Yeah.
And enlisting all his friends who were also now hawks on Iraq. And he went from being a columnist to being made executive editor of the New York Times in 2004 or so, after getting this all wrong. So we saw this remarkable moment when the press could have held people accountable and said, "Listen, you failed your responsibility to the American people. You got a major story wrong. It's had tremendously harmful effects on the American public. 4,500 American soldiers have died. We've destabilized an entire region. You're out. You blew it. Goodbye." But instead, they all move on, and they're still advising us today on how to see international events.
Well, so there's the same dismal story again and again, a kind of evil consensus that seems to grow stronger all the time. I guess I know we've kept you a long time, but is there any hope for this? Is there any alternative? Is there any way out?
Well, I don't really see it. I have to tell you, I hate to depress people. It's something I end up doing, and I'm just trying to tell stories that I know and have experienced. And at the end of them, people say, "Oh God, that's depressing." So
we get that a lot.
We get that too. That's why I love you, Bob. So.
And I really hate that. I mean, I hate that feeling of causing people to be depressed. But I think the openings are extremely narrow. Some of us who've tried to be honest journalists over long periods of time have some outlets here and there, not big ones, and often we're under attack even today. Mm-hmm. Consortium News came under attack by this anonymous group, Prop or Not, which is somehow the Washington Post decided was worthy of a front page story of 200 websites that they wanted to say were Russian propaganda or something. Yeah. And it was offensive, and it's false, but it is what it is, I guess. That's how things are played these days. But there are places that are trying to still tell the truth. Yeah. And sadly, to my view, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major news organizations have become more and more propaganda oriented. They won't go against the grain. If the grain may be, in this case, let's all bash Trump or let's all bash Putin, but that's no really different in a sense than let's all bash Danny Ortega or let's all bash Saddam Hussein. It's sort of like, if you're all part of this club, again, running with the pack, you're safe, and that's how things are done. But I think you have to. But there are some ways, and the internet has, for all its faults, has provided some openings to get stories out in an inexpensive way. That's why I've been doing it for 21 years or whatever now at Consortium News. But I can't say that I expect things to turn around. I don't see the personnel. I don't know how, after generations now, several generations of journalists being trained to do what they're basically told in this way, it's going to somehow be unwound. I'm not sure how you can unwind it.
Mm-hmm. The good news is, in a way, that we're only talking about the United States. And, I couldn't find a job in the United States. I was an academic and I couldn't find a job. Nobody wanted me. I went to New Zealand, and one thing that struck me very early on is there was a student newspaper there. And at Berkeley, where I'd been teaching, there was a student newspaper too. It was the Daily Cal. And it tried very hard to be the Washington Post with training wheels or something like that. It was immensely responsible and dull and careful and consensus. You go to New Zealand at the University of Otago, and the student newspaper is articulate, scurrilous, infuriating, hilarious, and would be called in American journalistic terms irresponsible. It was so much better than the Daily Cal. I couldn't believe it. So there are other places where, the livelier and braver traditions endure.
Well, I think that's probably true, but I'm also afraid that some of what the United States has been doing is now spreading to Europe, for instance. We're seeing the same kind of consensus-oriented approach. Canada, we came under attack recently in Canada because some woman reporter from Eastern Europe sent me a story that had to do with the Canadian foreign minister who's been lying about her grandfather, who was a Nazi collaborator. And so we wrote a story based off really on Canadian sources, because a lot of that's been sort of in an academic world been revealed there. But it was mostly about this foreign minister who was misrepresenting facts and misleading the people of Canada into how she reached their certain attitudes that she has toward things going on in Eastern Europe. And and instead of and then she denied that. She said it was all Russian disinformation, was how she put it. And the mainstream Canadian press just took her side.
Yeah.
They did. A day later, the Globe and Mail did say, well, it turns out that's all true, what we reported. But they continue to bash us.
Yeah, but it's still Russian propaganda. It's they've weaponized the truth.
Right. So now truth is disinformation.
Yeah.
It reaches there's this Orwellian component that we're now dealing with. But it just requires. I just think it requires people sticking to the real standards of journalism. And to that earlier comment about is our job to inform the American people so they can do their job as the true sovereigns of this nation, we the people. Is it our job to inform them and give them that information so they can decide which politician they want to kick out or keep in? Or is it our job to guide them, as Evan Thomas put it? I think that's a fundamental disagreement that some of us have. I feel my job is to just get the stories out as best I can that are important, interesting, and in a way that people can understand and read easily. And let them decide, But oddly, we're in this very strange moment historically, and I'm not sure where it ends or how it ends. So I guess we have to just keep reporting it and see where it goes.
And it's such a weird situation we're in, where the anti-establishment guy is way to the right of Reagan, although I guess in some areas, at least in rhetorically, he maybe is somewhat to the left in a popular way, but generally, a far right politician. And he's being painted. It's sort of the opposite of what the Reagan people and the reactionaries did in the late 70s, early 80s, when they painted any liberal as sort of a Soviet dupe or a Russian dupe. Now it's this far right-wing Republican guy, and anybody who's with him are all Kremlin-controlled dupes. And it's the liberals putting out this kind of crazy Cold War paranoia about Russians as these kind of magical sorcerers controlling everything and controlling our minds. I mean, it's just so bad. You know, you've been there for the whole cycle, starting in journalism in the 70s and late 70s, when it was the opposite, right? I mean, it was the left and the liberals who were under attack as dupes, and now you're under attack by liberals for being a Russian dupe. I mean, it's just, the world's really upside down crazy right now, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm afraid that there is this thing where there is this sort of mainstream consensus that you can violate, I guess, from one side or the other. But the key thing is it's often wrong. And as a journalist, you have to sort of deal with facts as best you can get them. And we have to understand that the U.S. government puts out a lot of things that are false. It wasn't just the WMD. I mean, some things are, you know, I've been sort of in situations where I've been talking to or conveying information to senior leadership in the U.S. government, and on one point, one sort of factual point, they kind of were acknowledging that I'd had it right, but they felt if they put out the truth, it would, quote, destroy the narrative that they were trying to build. I mean, and that happened with, I think, Obama. I think Obama sadly became seduced by this idea of using information in this way to, in some ways, the best he could to control things, and not just sort of putting out facts that the American people should have. But, you know, I think that is so. I don't think it's something you can say just the right is guilty or just the left is guilty or just the center is guilty. I think it's really an ad hoc situation that sometimes, you know, all parties sort of want to control information, and the job of the journalist should be to get to the facts as best you can, and then and tell the American people what as best you can. So, I mean, I think that remains sort of the standard, I think, that we have to always uphold. And when we lose it, and I've been under pressure from people from the progressive side, people I've been friends with for a long time, they're saying Trump is such a threat to everything. You have to abandon your journalistic principles. That's a luxury we can't afford. You have to join in the hashtag resistance, and that's just not my job. Yeah. And no one should expect it to be my job. But it's in the same way that back in the day, the Reagan people wanted me to be on board with their situation. That, you know, El Salvador, we have to protect freedom in El Salvador from the communist menace or whatever they were. Again, that's not my job, and I'm not going to falsify information or join in some cover up or some witch hunt just to be part of some group.
Yeah,
that's how I view it.
Okay,
good.
Well, we should probably let you go because we kept you a very long time. It was a great interview.
Great interview, yeah.
Thank you very much for talking to us.